Good morning. I'm very glad to introduce Keith Frikken. He's a PhD student from the CERIAS department. He's also affiliated with CERIAS. He does research on a number of different topics concerning information security, and he's also doing work on database systems. We are really proud to have him as a CERIAS student. So I'll give the floor to Keith.
I'd like to welcome everyone to my talk on hidden access control policies with hidden credentials. If at any time you'd like to ask a question, just let me know. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. The motivation for this work is that traditional access control models where you have someone requesting an object and where the object is, the decision to give the access to the object is usually given by the identity of the requester. The problem with this, if you have an environment like the internet, is that perhaps the requester and the resource owner are in different security domains, so having an identity doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, one of the typical ways that this is handled is instead of basing it on the identity of the requester, you can base it on the attributes of the requester. Of course, for such a system to work, you need some entity that will say, well, this person who has these attributes, I verify that they have these attributes. If you don't have such an entity, there's no real trust between the system because one person can just lie about what attributes they have. The typical way this is done is through some form of digital credential. And they can have many different types of digital credentials. You can have one for citizenship, perhaps age. Fairly common for many services, you need to be above a certain age threshold. Some physical condition, your employment status, a credit status, a membership in a group, or even a security clearance. In the last case, the security clearance becomes particularly interesting because many times, having something being at a certain, sensitive level, that itself is a sensitive information. Now, you could probably tell that, well, there's lots of things you could have attributes for, and if you had credentials for everything, these would be very sensitive. You wouldn't want to go around just telling everybody, here are all my attributes that I have. One, they could probably link back to your true identity, and then they know everything about you. But also, there are situations where the access policies are sensitive. Typically, in top secret type instances, you'll have many cases where the fact that this document is top secret in a certain project is sensitive, and you don't want to tell everybody that asks for that document that this document has that statement. But even in cases where things are not sensitive, immediately sensitive, there are advantages to treating them this way. First, there's better individual privacy. You wouldn't want to just go out, this is fairly obvious. You don't want to go out and tell everybody all of your attributes, even if they don't know who you are. Because every time you tell them some of your attributes, they learn more about you. But on the access policy side, if the access policy for a particular object is publicly known, then you know exactly what you need to get access to that object. So you can try to game the system. And if there are usually economic systems where you know everything about it and that you can guess things, it usually makes them less effective. However, a common criticism of this is, well, if I trust you enough to give you an object or for us to even talk, I trust you enough to kind of know some information about me. So we trust each other. So this, common criticism, well, if there's mutual trust, this doesn't happen. But there's better security even if mutual trust exists. If the two people negotiating trust each other, but Alice trusts Bob to know her credentials, that doesn't mean she doesn't have control over Bob's system. Bob's system could have spyware or many other things on it where someone else could get Alice's information by compromising Bob's system. And similarly, in the other way around. So it's just better security as a whole if you don't reveal these credentials and access policies. Also, if Bob comes along and creates some very novel business strategy that allows him to gain some competitive advantage, he doesn't want to go broadcast to everyone, well, this is what I'm doing with my access policies to give me some advantage. And thus, he'll have fewer immediate imitators, so he'll be able to gain some advantage. Just as kind of an overview here, the model of the computations, we have Alice, who we'll call the client for this negotiation, and she requests some message from Bob, we'll call it M. Bob has this message, and he has some policy for the message, or conceivably several policies for the message. And our goal is to create some type of protocol where Alice can input her credentials and that Bob can input this message in the policy, and that Alice will get the message if her credentials satisfies the policy. Now, this really can't use a third party. If you had a trusted third party between Alice and Bob, the solution is fairly simple. Bob sends the message and the policy to the trusted third party. Alice sends her credentials to it. And then the third party makes a decision and sends Alice the message if possible. And the difficulty with this is it's hard to find a trusted third party. That being said, there is a third party element to this protocol. There is someone that is certifying Alice's credentials. And this party doesn't work for this entity because Bob doesn't necessarily trust that entity with his policies. He trusts that entity to a degree to verify Alice's information, but that doesn't mean he trusts that entity to know his policies. Also, there's a difference between that entity knowing all of Alice's attributes versus knowing all of Alice's attributes and what she's asking for. So having that credential authority make the access decisions and be this trusted third party isn't desirable for either Alice or Bob. On top of that, if you were to use the trusted third party in that regard, it would become a bottleneck in the system. However, when you have a trusted third party, it is a fairly nice solution. You have a situation where, Alice and Bob does not learn anything about Alice's credentials. So our goal would be to have a system without a trusted third party where Bob does not learn anything about Alice's credentials. Bob does not learn whether Alice gets access or not. And this is nice because if Bob knew where Alice got access or not, he could change his policy every time Alice asked for something and glean information about Alice's attributes. Alice does not learn Bob's policy structures nor which credentials caused her to gain access. In our solution, we try to achieve a couple more things here. Alice cannot probe offline. She can't request the message once and then try different sets of credentials with just that one request to try to figure out if she has. You have a question?
Okay, so if Alice learns neither Bob's policy structure, when the basis of Alice wants to receive document X, she knows she can receive document X because, well, I have a security clearance or I'm of an age of X, so I should be able to get to it and then make the request that way.
Well, there are cases where that would be true. There are other cases where Alice thinks she might have the message, might have authority to get to the message, and perhaps she doesn't. And so she could request the message, and then if she doesn't get the message, she learns, well, I don't have access to that document. Perhaps she learned about the document through other documents that link to it, or something like this. Also, the policy needs not be monotonic. So you could have something like the absence of an attribute. Now, our goal is to try to achieve all these properties without a trusted third party. And a trusted third party, you can achieve all of these fairly easily. Now, the solution we'll talk about later gets close to achieving all these. It can't achieve all of these. Bob does learn like an upper bound on the number of attributes Alice has. It's kind of unavoidable without a trusted third party. Also, Alice learns a little bit of information about Bob's policy, but she doesn't learn everything about Bob's policy. There are some practical considerations to this, though. The first is that a non-monotonic policy might not make sense. You can't force Alice to use all of her credentials. She can choose which ones she uses. So an example would be, suppose Bob wanted to have, Alice does not have a credential saying she has a bad driving record. Well, if Alice has a credential saying, I have a bad driving record, Alice is not going to use that in a situation where, if I'm applying for insurance or something like that, why am I going to use my credential that I have a bad driving record? So in this case, you can't force Alice to use her credentials. And so she can use any subset. So if you have a non-monotonic policy, Alice just looks at her credentials beforehand. Do I think this will help or hurt me when getting access to this document?